welcome everyone to the next edition of the Success Series. This is a webinar series that we do exclusively for customers, meant to help you get more and more out of Sisense and really find that success to get the most out of your investment with us. So today, very specific topic. The point of these is that they are meant to be short, punchy. You know exactly what you're getting, very actionable coming into with those topics. Today is all about customizing pivot tables. Before I pass it to our host, Jeremy, today, speaker, I'm going to just go over some housekeeping items. If we can go to the next slide, please. Um, so no chat at the moment, but if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, as an attendee, you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to interact with us throughout the webinar and the presentation in that Q&A box. Obviously, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, feel free and drop them in there. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. We're going to try to keep things to the end. I'll be in there if there's anything short and quick that I can drop a response in, but please look for the Q&A at the end of the webinar. Of course, you can take notes, you can screenshots, whatever you want, but I will be sending a recording of today's session along with any links that Jeremy shares throughout the session, just so you have it and can interact with it after the webinar. And lastly, in that same post-webinar email, I will also be sending you over a survey. If you can take a couple minutes there and fill that out, it'll really help us understand, hey, are you finding this series useful? Is there other topics that are top of mind for you that you'd love us to cover? Anything we can do to get your feedback to really improve the session is music to my ears. So if you have a couple minutes, I'd really appreciate it if you can complete that survey in that post webinar email. So without further ado, let me get out of your face. I'm going to just share and showcase our speaker today. If we can go to the next slide, Jeremy, before I pass the mic over to you. This is Jeremy Friedel. He is a team lead in the software engineering, sitting on our field engineering team. Jeremy, thanks so much for taking the time to cover this topic that is obviously very specific, and we have some folks interested here. So thanks so much for joining. I'm going to go off camera, go on mute, and I'm going to pass the mic over to you. Awesome.
All right, thanks everyone. Let's begin the presentation. So I'll start with a table of contents. So we'll be covering customizing pivot tables, some overview and objectives, the Pivot 2.0 API, the style and content enhancement features, some practical examples of the Pivot 2.0 API, just overview of standard event scripting, events and overview, not specific to Pivot, but useful for Pivot, the general widget lifecycle, including the most common events used, some best practices and common pitfalls, and then we'll have key takeaways, and then we'll have the Q&A. So I'll start off basically the unique thing about the Pivot 2.0, which is the current version of Pivot in all Sisense versions that you would be interacting with, is that it has the Pivot 2.0 API, which allows you to customize the cells in unique ways that are not the same as you would in other widget types. So basically, this allows some deeper customization beyond some legacy Pivot capabilities. You might be familiar with the older style of Pivot scripting, where you, by very specific CSS selectors, you basically selected the HTML cell and then modified in some way, maybe change the style or maybe change the content. The Pivot 2.0 API avoids having to sort of manually select everything with CSS selectors. It just gives you basically a way to enter every cell and modify either style or content. It supports dynamic styling and content changes. Dynamic styling includes basically based on the number or value in it, you could change the, basically based on the value, you could set it, red if it's above a certain value, green if it's below a certain value, and so on. So this allows cell level customization that can be combined with event and CSS. So you can have a script that uses all three of those. You can have a script that uses events, the Pivot 2.0 API, and just standard CSS to modify styling. And there is a documentation link there. I'll go over that after I go over the slides. So how the Pivot 2.0 API works, sort of the most common function you're going to use in the Pivot 2.0 API is this transform pivot function. So it provides a structured, we call it an API, but it's a function to interact with pivot elements at the cell level. This includes basically all types of cells. So it includes the headers, the rows, the columns, and the individual cells, including the content cells. It interacts with the standard Sisense widget lifestyle, so it can be run at a specific widget lifestyle event. It can be integrated with that. It provides transformations at the cell level, so you can add it in a very specific cell, change the content, change the style. Basically, before that required some very specific CSS styling, and that might, if you modify the cell at all or modify the table at all, you would have to sort of rewrite your CSS. This is no longer required. Basically, you can have the complete metadata of the cell, and so you can know exactly what cell you're in and have dynamic styling and content based on that. It supports modifying both cell values and styling dynamically. It can work alongside CSS, including old style CSS scripts. It just is additional tool in the toolbox. So these are some additional tips and resources. And I'll go over briefly these community articles, and this will also be in the email, providing basically very detailed examples of how this can be used. So use the Pivot 2.0 API for cell level logic and data transformations. There's no longer really a reason to use, CSS, the old CSS style selection of a cell. Basically, if you are changing based on a cell level logic, you should be using the Pivot 2.0 API. It can integrate and use events for lifestyle-driven behavior. And you can still use CSS for styling in combination with and also separate from the Pivot 2.0 API. Basically, the Pivot 2.0 widget type is still basically an HTML table, so it can still be modified by CSS. So I'll move on to the next slide here. So yes, let's do a live demo. Let me just get that up. Okay, so let me just share. Let me just share the whole window. Okay, hi everyone. So here, for example, we have here, we modified the content and we modified the style. So we went from this on the left-hand side to before. The after, so you can see you can do some pretty dynamic and custom changes to a pivot table. We have both the content changed and the coloring and the text itself. Here again, similar. Not so much a content change, but we have the coloring base changed. And so I'll go and to show you what that script looks like. And as you can see, if this was an old style CSS type script, this would probably be many hundreds of lines. Here we have a very compact, 52-line script, basically that just does things like, modifying the cell.content, modifying the cell.style. So this basically is a CSS object. We just basically use standard CSS parameters and change them as needed. And we can use very simple, if else. I mean, obviously any programmatic style that fits your needs, you can. And you see here the widget.transform pivot we've been talking about, which is the most common function you're going to be using in the Pivot 2.0 API. I'll show some further examples. So here we have centering content. So this is a very just CSS style type thing. We just take the table and center it. And so you see here, I just wanted to hover over the point where you can still just use pure CSS type scripting. So basically, if you have something, it would make the most sense to just use CSS to modify things and not use the Pivot 2.0 API. You can. Basically, the Pivot 2.0 widget type is still ultimately an HTML table, and it still responds to CSS. So you can do things like just modify the CSS. It just standard HTML and can be modified in that way. I'll just go some more examples here on demos. So conditional highlighting. So basically here, if it's above a certain value, it's green. If it's below a certain value, it's red. Similar type things there. And the script for that is here. Again, this is compared to the old CSS type scripts, this is relatively compact for the functionality. And we just go into the cell.style and set the CSS parameter, in this case, the background color and the color, which is the text color. And then we have this here, which does similar. And you can see here, you can have in the script, if you needed, multiple widget.transform pivots if needed. And you see in the metadata, you can have if statement based on some type of metadata. So here, for example, if we want to just something to apply to only a certain type of column index or so on, we could do so. There's also a row index. And basically, you can narrow down the scripts. Context it, basically, you only want to modify some cells and leave the rest of the cells sort of unmodified. You can just, using the metadata context, use if statements. Here's a bit of a more complicated example. So we see here, basically, we take these dummy columns and we change both the header and the content. And we get that there. We have a custom Jackal request. that basically gets the content and replace them. So that shows that you can combine multiple things using this. So we have a standard widget event script that runs a custom Jackal API call to get additional data, and then we replace the content. So just you see here that was the before. This is the after. We took the dummy columns and replaced them there, and we see here we actually take using this disabled panel item here, and we're just using it to make the API call. So this is a pretty long script, but you can see here, basically, ultimately, we make that Jackal API call, and then we do that transform pivot at the end of the day to get the data. So basically, we have this big object that contains the data we're looking for, and then ultimately we use a transform pivot to provide that cell content. I did want to just go over briefly the Pivot 2.0 documentation that I mentioned earlier. So this is the most common method, the transform pivot. Basically, we have here type, basically whether we want the values of the members or other types of cells. We can have functions or anonymous functions in here. So you can do it either the style, or if you want, you can name the function, and then you can do sort of the code we've been doing. There are some other functions that are less often used. There's configure pivot, which just has some pivot configuration that's documented here. So you can take a look at that, disable drill, disable select, global styles. You can modify sorting, sorting target. These are sort of very specific. And then you sort of have these Pivot 2.0 cell specific events, like cell click. Basically, you can have custom functionality on a cell click, cell enter, just basically when the mouse pointer enters a cell, and just when the mouse pointer leaves a cell. So this is sort of it's just an additional event that's unique to the Pivot 2. You don't use the transform pivot in this context. It just, instead of widget on initialize, you have widget on cell leave. And similar, and we have some examples that like is in the slides that will be shared. And let's go to the slideshow again, and then I'll go back to the documentation. Let's go. Okay, so the widget lifecycle. So this, if you're familiar with scripting, even beyond in other types of widget types beyond Pivot, you're probably familiar with this basic concept. There are a few others, but basically this is sort of the basic flow. We have basically widget.on initialized, the widget is created, the query started, the query is begun, query end, basically the query is ended, process result, the data is being transformed from the raw form to the process form that Sisense expects. Widget rendered, basically the widget is rendered onto the page, and then ready, it's fully done, being rendered and is available. So you can combine basically the widget events and the transform pivot. So basically, if it only makes sense to transform the pivot after a certain point, you could do so. And if you want, for example, like let's say there's something that you need something about the query available. In my example where we had a custom Jackal request that happened at the before query event, basically we can have basically that data available before we do the transform pivot. The transform pivot in practice happens in the render stage. It will always happen, but you can, if basically you need some event context, you can use event scripts as well. And like we saw with the CSS-based scripts, we can also have scripts that just use the widget events to just apply CSS or other type code that doesn't directly interact with the Pivot 2.0 API. So I will share that. Actually, I'll just share again the widget events. So basically here, the full list of events. So the most common ones are initialized, before query, we mentioned query start, query end, process result, render and ready. This is all documented and available. Okay, and let's go to the slideshow. So we saw all these live demos, widget events in action, CSS customization, dynamic cell content updates. So some key takeaways. The Pivot 2.0 expands customization. So it provides control over both structure and presentation, enabling more tailored and interactive pivot experience. As you show, this can get very custom. We can really modify the look and feel and content of a pivot table using scripting. Events drive dynamic behavior. So you can use the widget lifecycle events to allow logic to run at key stages, enabling real-time updates as data changes. As I showed, there's also 3 Pivot 2.0 specific events, the cell click, the cell enter, the cell leave, and also the standard Sisense widget events that are present in basically all widget types. As I showed in that example, CSS handles presentation. You can still use any type of CSS-based scripting in combination with and also separate from the Pivot 2.0 transform pivot. This manages layout and styling, works alongside scripting for complete customization approach. Combining approach unlocks advanced use cases. So this enables conditional formatting, dynamic labeling, and custom interactions beyond standard configurations. So that script I showed where we completely replace the column by making an additional Jackal call, getting the results, and then replacing the cell content is sort of an example where we had both. We had all three. We had a CSS-based scripting, just stuff like moving the contents to the right and setting the color. We replace the content, use the transform pivot, and we use the widget events to make a custom Jackal call to get additional data to represent the widget, even though the panels were actually disabled in that example. So it just shows you can combine all three methods. Just as all the examples show, maintain clean structure. So basically, you should have a clear like hierarchy. Basically, you should have a transform pivot where the transform pivot happens. You should have, if you have a widget event, that widget event should be in its own function, and so on. And then basically you can have a variable that sort of transforms needed data between them. So separating the logic from styling and keep code modular, ensure scalability and maintainability. So I'll also share the three community articles that I linked to earlier, and I'll just briefly go over them, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So this will be linked in the slideshow when it's shared. So here we have, for example, we transformed the text to arrows here. Basically, we used the transform pivot, and we basically just replaced this with the Unicode character. And so you can see you can do that. You can have conditional logic, basically based on a value, what type of arrow is shown. And just to show you sort of the old style, this is basically, we can do that without ever using the Pivot 2.0 API. The Pivot 2.0 API is cleaner, and in most cases is going to be what you want to use, but you can do that. You can place it with Unicode arrows, so just that's the community article there. This one is just sort of a common use case, basically the number of metadata panels. Basically, this one is specific to actually having it on a per group level customization, sort of showing you can bring in outside logic. Basically, we get the group ID, we get the maximum panels. The core of the code is ultimately here, the widget that manifests that data, that panels, just the max items. This is a very common script that people have already been using, basically to change the maximum amount of panels that the Pivot 2.0 can handle. And here is a very similar example to what I showed with the cell content replacement. So here, basically, we had a bunch of ones because this is the number of unique values, and we want to place it with the content. And so here we show how we make a custom Jackal request, and then ultimately use that custom Jackal request to transform the pivot. Basically, we have this basically object that includes the custom data we got from Jackal call, and basically we have this function here that finds the right value and just replaces the content there. So that is the presentation. I think I'm ready to open up to Q&A now.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Clearly, you've been paying attention to the Success Series because that is a masterclass in how we like to run things quick, specific, backed by a bunch of stuff that our folks can, users and customers alike can look in afterwards to participate. So, so clear, in fact, that there are no Q&A questions at the moment. So I'll leave it open for another minute or two in case there are some folks typing in a question right now. But as Jeremy mentioned, anything that you see and saw today, any links, I'll make sure to share that in that post-webinar email. Again, we're looking forward for some of your suggestions in that survey. And I guess a sneak peek for our folks here later in April, we're also going to have our next quarterly roadmap webinar, the What's New with Sisense. So please look out in our customer newsletter, look out for emails in your inbox to attend and register for that one as well. If you aren't receiving, for the folks that are here today, I'm pretty sure you would have received an email or some sort of invite to participate, but for some reason, if you're not seeing or receive our monthly customer newsletter or any of the comms that I send out, feel free to reach out to your CSM or me directly at preston.lam@sisense.com, preston.lam@sisense.com, and I can help you get resubscribed or added to our mailing list. So yeah, Max, I see Max on here, so I said his name, but Jeremy, I don't see any open or questions coming in our Q&A. So I think we have we're gonna wrap it up for today. Just a really quick and efficient success series. Thanks so much for taking the time to present to our users about pivot tables, and hopefully we will have you on for a future success series.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Get that thank you back on the screen. Awesome. All
Yes.
right. Thanks everyone. See you next time. Bye.